All right. This is your Gaza War sit rep day 128. Um, Last time, oh, well, yes, I should say we do military analysis of the Gaza War that does not disdain Arab military capacities and understands guerrilla warfare. Since the last sit rep was with John Elmer, and we broke down the ceasefire proposals, which themselves in turn broke down as Netanyahu rejected them and then proceeded to issue an evacuation order, as if the Palestinians in Gaza can be ordered by him, issue an evacuation order for Rafah. I guess we have to understand what Rafah is and what the overall, I mean, if you want to glorify the word, if you want to glorify what Israel's been doing by using the word strategy, then we have to talk about the strategy of what Israel has been doing. And I'm just looking for a map to show you. We'll just use this one. Okay. So at the beginning, and it's been months, we're on the 5th month of the war. So, but when the war started, when Israel began, Israel was claiming that Hamas's stronghold was Gaza City, and Gaza City is the biggest city in the Gaza Strip. It's the big city of Gaza. The rest are smaller, much smaller cities and refugee camps. So Gaza City was supposedly the stronghold of Hamas, and Israel was going to go destroy them. And they told everybody to go south. People went south, and people went south, and to Khan Yunis. Some months later, many people had moved to Khan Yunis. There were still lots of people in Gaza City, but for the most part, about a bulk group of the population of Gaza City has gone down, avoiding bombings and the cutting off of water and the supplies of food and everything else. Israel then began to bombard and attack Khan Yunis, and people fled again. And now they're at Rafah, which is right on the border with Egypt. And Egypt has closed this border. There's nowhere for them to go. And there's 1.4 million people in Rafah now. Again, the bulk of the people from Gaza, this entire strip, have moved into Rafah. And Israel has begun shelling, bombing, and a generalized standoff attack, which is their favored method against civilians in Rafah. So John and I were talking about how catastrophic and unthinkable it would be to attack this concentration of civilians. Gaza was always one of the most densely populated places. They've confined the people of Gaza to an even smaller corner, and they're bombing that corner. So anyone who thinks this is something other than an extermination campaign does not really have anything to stand on there. So what does the bombing of Gaza, of Rafah, look like? One report I saw says that they killed 63 Palestinians in Rafah, bombed homes and mosques. And that was over just a very short period of maybe an hour. So they're killing at a really, I saw another number that's over 110. So they're killing at a much higher pace, which is of course predictable given the concentrations of people. Now, the idea that this is not going to do anything to Hamas, of course, and Hamas is not going to be drawn out into a battle around these densely populated refugee camps, which is exactly what Israel would want. fight around people. That's not what Hamas does. It's what Israel says Hamas does, right? They claim that the Palestinian resistance uses human shields. Israeli soldiers use human shields routinely. Palestinian resistance is not. As we've shown in other sit reps, we've shown maps of where most of the fighting is. Most of the fighting now, most of the attacks and ambushes against Israeli troops are in Khan Yunis and Gaza. These are the areas that the Israelis have told people to leave and where the bulk of people have left. And these have become the battlefields. To the extent that Israel is present there, they're under fierce attack by the Palestinian resistance, which is why they've withdrawn from these areas, withdrawn for the most part, and are now focusing on attacking the civilian population in Rafah. Do I have anything to add to this? This is going to be the worst phase in terms of civilian destruction, mass murder, genocide. This is a concentration of what we've been seeing for the past 4 months. This is an intensification. And one commentator I always recommend, Amal Saad, she's Lebanese English professor and knows Hezbollah. She wrote the book on Hezbollah, literally. She wrote a really good book on Hezbollah called Hezbollah, Politics and Religion. And she had this thread a couple of days ago when Netanyahu was making the plan, the Israeli prime minister was making the plan to invade Rafah. And she said, Israel's set to invade Rafah, not in spite of, but precisely because of the fact that it's a densely packed refugee camp where 1.1 million people, including 600,000 children, have nowhere else to flee. First, this is to present the horrific war crimes that are about to ensue as a symbolic victory. I'm not sure about that. My analysis is that it's just Israel doing what Israel does, and not that there's much strategy. I'll talk a little bit more about Israeli strategy and the whole notion of whether we can glorify the word strategy, as I said in the beginning. Second, Israel hopes to create new facts on the ground to strengthen its negotiating position in the talks, use these new facts, new massacres and territories as a tactical advantage. This is leveraged because Hamas has made the protection of civilians a key demand in the talks, cessation of hostilities, provision of temporary housing, lifting the siege, etc. This is what we broke down in our last sit rep. If Israel genuinely believed that Hamas hides behind its civilian population, it wouldn't be able to use displaced Palestinians as a bargaining chip. In other words, Israel recognizes that Hamas is a true representative of the Palestinian people and is accountable to them. I think those are good points. Now, I guess I should say something about strategy. And I've said this, I think, in a much earlier sit rep, probably months ago, that Israel is not the kind of strategic player that makes a plan and kind of announces it and then methodically puts it forth. So everybody's probably watched the interview with Putin by an American journalist that came out a couple days ago. And if you studied the Russian campaign in Ukraine, if you followed the way that the Russians prosecute that war, they kind of said at the beginning, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take back these Russian territories, Russian majority territories in Ukraine. We're going to destroy the Ukrainian military, and we're going to eradicate the Nazi ideology. They announced these goals, and then they announced more or less everything they were going to do, and then they proceeded to do it. And if you followed, for example, the battle for Bakhmut, or if you followed the recent battle for Avdiivka, it was not a battle based on deception, rapid moves, rapid advance, blitzkrieg, double, triple agent deception kinds of layers within layers. It's this methodical strategy, and sometimes it's like that. You'll have players that are like that in war, that strategists that work that way. But the Anglo-American Israeli pattern is more like um, lots of firepower, lots of psychological warfare, lots of exploitation, and then see what happens. See what opportunities there are to exploit. See what you can get. See how you can exploit a situation to the maximum, and get other people to do your work for you. So the strategy of Israel here is just the same as they've always been doing. They're going and they're attacking the civilian population and they're destroying everything. They're destroying the civilian infrastructure. They're trying to induce starvation. And they're counting on the support of the West, Western politicians. I guess I should say something about the Western politicians. And I don't think this is anything to note. I don't think this is a sign that the tide is turning or anything like that. But there was some kind of simultaneous, Bernie Sanders and AOC and this guy from the United Kingdom here, whatever. He says there are millions of displaced Palestinians in Rafah. The fighting must stop now. We need a sustainable ceasefire. Sustainable ceasefire is a special United Kingdom language for Hamas surrender. So in a way, it's just the same bleating about how Hamas needs to surrender that we've always been hearing. The German genocide supporters were a very similar statement. They said something like, Rafah's horrible, it shouldn't happen. But of course Israel has the right to defend itself. So there's some kind of broadcasting of the tragedy of Rafah and the tragedy to come. I don't really see anything coming of it, or anything good anyway. I gather there's some kind of public signaling going on, but I don't think they're trying to rein Israel in, because that would look very different. That would involve actual reductions in, for example, the weapons that they're selling to Israel to kill Palestinians with. Okay. Meetings on the other side. The Iranian foreign minister went to Beirut and had a meeting with Nasrallah and the Palestinian resistance leaders. This was from Aria's feed. There's some photos from the meeting. Nasrallah and the Iranian foreign minister. So they had a meeting, I guess, yesterday. I'm sure they were talking about the imminent invasion of Rafah, among other things. Yeah, like I said, I don't know much about how this is gonna. We don't know how this is gonna unfold, but based on the concentration of people there, this is going to be one of the worst. We've seen the worst things of our lifetimes over the past 4 months, and there's every reason to believe this is going to be worse than all of those. Okay. Because it's Rafah, because Rafah is on the border with Egypt, I think we should talk a bit more about Egypt. I've been studying Egypt. I've been studying the 1967 war and the 1973 war. And I think I'm going to talk about Egypt a couple of times, including today, in addition to the previous talk on Egypt that I had a couple sit-reps ago. So just before that, let me just tell you a couple of summary information from the government media office in Gaza. So 128 days. The government media office in Gaza counts 2,438 separate massacres, 35,176 missing. So 7,000 of them are missing. 28,176 of them have reached the hospitals. 12,300 of them are children. 8,400 of them are women. 340 medical workers, 46 civil defense, 124 journalists, 67,784 wounded, 10,000 cancer patients at risk of death, 700,000 with infectious diseases, 8,000 cases of viral hepatitis, 60,000 pregnant women are at risk, 350,000 chronic patients are at risk due to lack of administration of medications, 2 million displaced, 100 schools and universities completely destroyed, 184 mosques completely destroyed, 3 churches targeted and destroyed, 70,000 residential units completely destroyed, and 290,000 residential units partially destroyed, 66,000 tons of explosives, 30 hospitals taken out of service, 53 health centers taken out of service, 150 health centers partially destroyed by the occupation, 123 ambulances completely destroyed, and 200 archaeological and heritage sites destroyed by the occupation. The last thing before we do some history, I just want to show this video of this doctor. You've seen this doctor, this female doctor. She throws her, she's like, hold my jacket, takes off her jacket, and then boom, she goes to get a patient. There's a sniper that's shooting people so they can't get to the patient, but she goes and some backup comes and she gets some patient. So that's, it's one of the most courageous things you'll ever see in your life. And it's only, I don't know, I guess it balances, matches the scale of the atrocity as the courage. Okay, so about Egypt. I mentioned, I think, in the sit rep with John Elmer that there's this whole plan. Again, plan is a generous word, but there's a plan or an idea to drive the people of Gaza into the desert, into the Egyptian desert, the Sinai, the desert of the Sinai Peninsula, and then let them die. So that's a genocidal pattern that's somewhat common. 20th century genocides, the genocide of the German genocide of the Herero and Nama people in Namibia, present-day Namibia. They did that basically by forcing them into the desert where they died of thirst. And then people who walked out of the desert were put in concentration camps, death camps, to die, prisons, where they died of exposure and thirst and hunger. That's the German genocide. The Germans are supporting this Israel in this conflict as well. So plenty of historical continuity there. And then the Turkish genocide against the Armenians, same thing. They marched them to the desert of Syria, actually, Deir ez-Zor, where they died of thirst and exposure in thousands and thousands. So this is probably what Israel's hoping to do. But early in the war, when Israel announced this plan, which they did quite openly and have repeated openly, and this is one of these things that the Western leaders just ignore. They just simply ignore that Israel's saying this or doing this or planning this. The Egyptian authorities said, we can't accept this because what's going to happen is the Palestinians are at some point going to attack Israel from Sinai, and then Israel's going to counterattack into Egyptian territory, and then our territory is going to become the site of a war, and then it's going to make a mess of things. And that's true. Israel will not relinquish the administration of this genocide to anyone else. They want to do it themselves. They want to control it in the most hands-on way, and they're not going to trust it to anyone. So the idea of displacing the inhabitants of Gaza into Sinai cannot happen unless Egypt hands over the Sinai to Israel. Now, maybe you know, or maybe you don't. I know lots of you are old. I'll stop making this joke. But you may know that Israel occupied this portion of Egypt, the entire Sinai Peninsula, in the 1967 war. So the 1967 war, Israel was in possession of the Sinai Peninsula. They kept the Sinai Peninsula through the 1973 war, through the War of Attrition, through a series of fruitless negotiations, through Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, and eventually, when another war, there was an imminent threat of more war, kind of an ongoing threat of more war between Egypt and Sinai after Sadat was assassinated in 1981. Israel finally gave it back. So this would be this part of Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, would have to go back to Israel for this to work, for Israel's plan to work. Is Israel willing to give back? I mean, is Egypt willing to give back the Sinai to Israel? I don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe for the right price, they will. It's hard to imagine Egypt saying no to Israel about anything. Now, the present regime of Egypt is not likely to do anything that to upset Israel or the United States. So maybe they will, but maybe they won't. And in any case, that's what it would entail. So it's not just a matter of kicking them out. It's really a matter of Israel retaking this gigantic chunk of Egyptian territory. So now, I talked last time about the 1967 war and how Egypt did a whole series of really incomprehensible reorganizations of troops and orders so that to make their military totally dysfunctional just weeks before the Israeli invasion of the Israeli attack of 1967. Why they did this is I now feel like I understand it a lot better, because I read this book called Soldiers, Spies, and Statesmen. And its author is Hazem Kandil. And I'm just going to show you the cover because it's a good book. And it's really, geez, they're not making it easy to look just to show you this book. Okay, how about Goodreads? Goodreads will let me show you. So here's the cover. Get the book, check it out. It's an Egyptian Palestinian friend of mine, I won't say who it is, recommended this book to me, and it's quite good. It's very readable, a very interesting book. And Hazem Kandil basically explains it in terms of, so everybody thinks of a military dictatorship as like, there's the military, there's society, and the military is in charge, and there's no like, the military suppresses civil and civilian participation in politics, right? But what's amazing about Hazem Kandil's book is he talks about the regime as having different bases. So there's a military base, but there's also a police and security state apparatus. So these are two different blocks. And then popular legitimacy and democracy is like a much smaller, and the business community is less. So ultimately, there's contests for power between different sources of armed force. There's the military, there's military intelligence, there's civilian intelligence and civilian police. And he talks about the players, the people involved in all of these. So if you understand that, you understand that the Egyptian, whoever's in charge in Egypt, their first and most important priority is not getting overthrown by other players in this scheme. So if you're like a civilian military intelligence person and you've become the president, then you're worried about army leaders that might get more popular than you, or more powerful than you, or more power, a bigger power base. Or if you're an army leader that's come to power, the same thing. You're worried about different factions within the armed forces that might come to power or that might overthrow you. So what happened in the lead up to 1967 was that an army commander named Amer was in a conflict with the president, Nasser. Nasser had come to power from the army as a prestigious army commander who had fought in the 1948 war, actually, against Israel. And he was part of the Free Officers, and they had a coup, and Nasser became the kind of first among equals, kind of, but he became more of a civilian president, and then he had to worry about these other sources of military force or armed force that could overthrow him. So Amer was in control of the army, and Amer was making all kinds of decisions to prevent Nasser from marginalizing him. And so all of these decisions that were made in 1967 were not made according to a military logic facing the Israeli threat. And that's why they lost, despite having, as I've said before, more men, vastly more resources compared to Israel. Even as a poor country, there's no way that a country 8 or 9 times the size of Israel should lose multiple wars against Israel, which they did. And they were also hoping, the idea of 1967 was to kind of repeat what apparently had happened in 1956, which was a very short war, military loss, but then which turned into a political victory. And the support, the United States president at the time in 1956 was made these decisions to kind of kick the other imperialists out of the Middle East. But then the president in 1967 established that they were going to back Israel no matter what forever. And Nasser, actually, there's a passage from Hazem Kendall's book where he says Nasser realized that after Israel kind of blew up the USS Liberty, one of the US ships, and the US didn't even really do anything about it, the Nasser, the president of Egypt, he realized that the US had no leverage over Egypt at all. And so he came to that conclusion. I mean, had no leverage over Israel at all. And he came to that conclusion, which is a very important conclusion, which his successor, Anwar Sadat, did not subscribe to. But that gets to the 1973 war, which I don't want to get too deep into. There is one last thing I want to say about the 1967 war, which I'll elaborate more when I get to the 1973 war. But there are these, to look at a terrain map, okay? Let's look at a terrain map of Egypt, of Sinai and Israel. And I'll just show you the mountainous nature of this terrain. So these, if you know, like the idea of a relief map or a topographic map, the closer together these lines are, the more wrinkly these lines are, the more mountainous it is. So there's mountains all here, and these are apparently like the key mountain passes. So if you want to control the Sinai, you have to control the Mitla and the Gidi passes. And this wasn't important. And this whole area is under Egyptian control now, but these are the areas where these are the passes that were under Israel's control, or some kind of demilitarized situation in the lead up to the 1973 war. And though when Israel made its 1967 attacks, the army wanted to retreat to these passes and hold them. They're very holdable once you have them, and then counterattack from there. But Amer, the incompetent military commander, ordered a really hasty retreat from these passes, leading to the loss of the entire Sinai. So that situation, even after the entire Air Force was destroyed, even after Israel had made these rapid advances, had the Egyptian army held at this kind of second line of defense, that would they would have been able to hold and counterattack. It wouldn't have been the disaster that it was. Now, in the 1973 war, I'll just say these passes again were the objective of the army. Nasser had died of a heart attack, I think 1970 or 71. So had Amer. Amer had been poisoned sometime before that. But these passes were the objective of the military commanders. But Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt that succeeded Nasser, he wanted to make a show of force and then get the Americans to get the Israelis to just give it back. So he didn't go for the passes. He just crossed the Suez Canal and then spread his forces out over a long line and then waited for the Americans to rearm Israel with a whole bunch of new equipment. He gave them, he told Israel that they would not be attacking, they would not be advancing. So Israel focused on crushing the Syrian attack against the occupied Golan Heights, and then patiently rebuilt their force for a counterattack here. And they didn't have to worry about Egypt being in these passes. I'll talk more about this. I have a couple of books waiting for me that I'll get more into. So what's the point of all this history? The point of all this history about Egypt specifically is that Egypt is going to be, Egypt and what Egypt does now is going to be really pivotal in how the next phase of this genocide unfolds. Right now, Egypt suppresses and ensures that help cannot get to Palestinians through Rafah, and they ensure that Palestinians cannot go back and forth through this crossing. So Egypt will not be, Egypt has through its actions ensured that Palestinians do not have a safe zone or a safe place to retreat in Egypt, which is the obvious place. It's the obvious border, the Rafah crossing, and that border, which Israel has rights to. Egypt has given Israel the right to inspect and control what goes in and out of Rafah, which makes no sense, but it's all part of what Egypt has agreed to under Sadat and since. So the way that this thing is going to unfold Egypt has everything. What Egypt does has everything to do with how this is going to unfold. And what Egypt is going to do, we don't know, but from historical analysis of how Egypt has behaved and what the Egyptian regime is, we can assume that Egypt is going to act in such a way as to primarily preserve the regime's desire to, whatever regime power struggles, whatever imagined threats to the president's rule, that's the absolute priority. Way down below those priorities is the territorial integrity of Egypt, the preservation of its army and its sovereignty, much less things like development or solidarity with the Palestinians. So we are moving into a period where Palestinians in Rafah are concentrated in Rafah. They're under increasingly intense bombardment in Rafah, and they're up against a border with an utterly unprincipled and unfeeling regime in the Egyptian regime. So it's that's the picture today on day 128. There are always intangibles and unpredictables, but as far as what Israel is likely to do and try to do, what Egypt is likely to do, those are fairly predictable and by their past behavior. So in this sense, we can only hope that there are things that are going to factor into this that are not under Egypt and Israel's control. And I guess we'll see what those are, and we'll talk about them next, SITREP, as well as continuing some historical analysis of Egypt and the 1973 war. Oh, sorry, yes, I forgot to tell you, please like and subscribe and follow and do all of those things. And I'll talk to you again soon.